Hello, Cecil. It's colder here than I thought. I should be home for Christmas this year, so there's only 10 months left in my rotation. Tell Mom I've got a roundabout state. It is exciting to finally see the glaciers in person rather than in a textbook. Hope everyone at home is warm and safe. Hello, Cecil. Thanks for checking in. Your emails are always nice, and I love to hear how everyone is doing. Please keep writing. After this job, I hope to land a university position so I won't be away so long. Hello, Cecil. The most extraordinary man just appeared in the thick of a blizzard. He was frostbitten all over, and we took him into the research center. Thawing him by the furnace, he simply stared into the flames, transfixed by the cold. He didn't seem like he wanted to be alone, though, so I sat with him. Ansel brought him soup. When he said thank you, we realized that he was American. Shocked to see him this far north, we were all eager to hear why he was wandering around in the snow. He wasn't eager to tell us. After much pressing, he relented. I swear to you, Cecil, these are the very words he spoke. Rare for any of us to receive chills up here. So I recorded every word. The following, Cecil, is the full confession of Victor Salem. I don't suppose I can keep it a secret forever. I don't know if I should hold it in anymore. I'm looking for someone. It's not the kind of one you understand. He's a different sort of one. I wish I could I'm sorry. I don't know where to begin. My hands are hurting and my head is still spinning, but the memories swimming in my head are so much worse. I don't know where to start. What could you possibly want to know? I could tell you all of it, but I'm afraid you'd never sleep at night again. It's a terrible fate. Trust me. I was so young, it feels, when I got my letter to Yale. Victor Salem, welcome to Yale College. The nameless voice of the letter welcomed me. I was ecstatic. My father was ecstatic. I had specifically told him to wait on a donation. I needed to know that I got in on my own merit. I'm sure you hear, this is a research station, right? I'm sure you all know the feeling of that letter. I ran next door to Liza. It was quite a run, though, through their ranch. I arrived panting. Her parents were never home, but I knew she would be. She liked to stay at home. I showed her the letter. Her smoky green eyes watered at the news. I missed those eyes. I knew she was proud. Liza was still slightly hurt by the news, though, since it was far from home. I had given her a ring a month before. It was a promise ring of sorts. I had no intention of finding a home or romance anywhere else. I simply wanted the opportunities afforded by this graduate program. I would be working with the finest bio researchers in the continent. She held me so long that day. I'd never leave her arms, knowing what I know now. The first term was promising. Henry Schliemann, my first professor, took a liking to me. He showed me his private project. Schliemann was the world's leading researcher in bioregeneration. You're expecting me to speak of stem cells next? It wasn't stem cells he was using, though. Artificial bioregeneration is peculiar, to say the least. The lab stank. He had patch after patch of rotting flesh hanging all around. My stomach turned. He laughed. Your nose gives into it after a few months, he told me. His comfort was ineffective at calming my nausea. This is better demonstrated, Henry assured me, as you won't believe the effects. He took a knife and cut through a piece of flesh. Pigskin, he said. I remember staring at the blood on the knife. Why was there so much blood? The skin soaked in the special solution of the petri dish. Blood swirled through it. It was no longer clear. The skin was certainly rotten in the dish, since you could see black spots along with the smell. I didn't understand why the blood wasn't dry. He placed the petri dish over a set of magnets, and he placed 2 electrodes in the dish. He then turned a knob, similar to the electric power of an old model train. The liquid sizzled. He stood back a bit. A watchpot never boils, Professor Schliemann said, looking pleased. After waiting a while in his study, we emerged back into the lab. The stench hit harder this time, as if all the rot had boiled into the air. To my astonishment, it had. Henry laughed again. I couldn't believe what I saw next, though. I understand it all too well now. The dead, rotting flesh wasn't rotting anymore. It's as if each cell came back to life and the skin actually healed. We are far from any practical applications yet, he sighed to me. Other than this magic trick, we seem to be chasing only dead ends. In the Commons one afternoon, I sat next to another student, Bill. He was a talker. I knew his life story before I finished my sandwich. As he spoke, the light glared off his thick glasses. Nearing the final bites of my turkey club, he held out a mysterious puck in front of me, with another puck floating perfectly above it. Do you like it? He asked. I, dumbstruck, nodded. It's from my research. We can 3D print magnets to be more precise. Feeling that Bill wasn't a waste of brain, I began to prod him more. Fast friends we were. I took him home that summer. He had no plans to return to his family. Rough relations there, you see. Leaving the plane, I can't help but remember that fresh upstate flower smell. Liza always smelled just like them. She wasn't there, however. No one but the cab driver with a sign. It was a long drive home that day. I was eager to see them. I was so eager to see each one of them. My mother grabbed me first. Her hair was too silver for her age. She was crying. "You're acting as if I'm back from the dead, Mother," I told her. "Right? You don't call?" she retorted. My mother was right, though. I had a habit of getting far into my studies. "Dead to the world he can be with his nose in a book," my father would often declare. "This is Bill," I said, deciding to change the subject. "Put her there, Bill." My father was the chummy business type. He held out his hairy hand. "I want to hear all about your magnet work." Her smoky green eyes called to me from across the parlor. Liza was eager for me just to turn to her. Her smile burst as our eyes met. I ran to her. "One less year apart," she said to me. Her voice sang out like distant bells and cascading syrup. "Your mother and I made you a cake." I was shocked that anyone could stand my mother long enough to make a cake. She always has a pressing and bossy way about her when she organizes events or even makes Jell-O. She really must have loved. I think, really, she loved all of us. Liza was carrying a basket of eggs with her. "Why don't you set those down?" I asked her. "I'm Mother Henning," she responded. "I want to keep these eggs until they hatch. There's a warmer in the basket." I admired her motherliness. I didn't want to clean up after 17 chickens when they hatched and started defecating everywhere, though. "Welcome home, Victor," I heard our housekeeper Yvonne call out, carrying the cake. "I'm eager for a slice, too," my Aunt Mary called out. She and her little daughter had just arrived. My niece, Cynthia, whose white blonde hair gleamed as she trotted, ran to Liza first. Cynthia was 6 then. She was only 7 when... I'm getting ahead of myself. I wasn't as excited as I should have been to see everyone together, to see everyone whole. Liza took Cynthia to play. I showed Bill the house. It was the start of a rousing yet short summer. Every morning, Bill and I started out on some new adventure, and every evening I lay under the stars with Liza. However, I couldn't stop thinking about that blood, dripping rotten flesh in Henry Schlieman's research lab. I laid awake at night wondering about that. Dead flesh was healed. It was nothing short of a modern miracle. But how could he have no working application? I was eager to get back to school and find out more, but the summer rolled on. One night, Liza and I rode deep into her parents' land. We laid there looking at the stars. I was explaining all the constellations, and my hand hit her basket of eggs. One popped out from under the blanket and landed outside the basket. The chick was not ready to hatch yet. Yolk oozed out, and a small chirping crept from the egg. Liza screamed and ran towards it. She leaned over the egg, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Soft, her smoky green eyes helplessly watched the bird struggle against the raw world it was unprepared for. It rolled violently for a moment, then eased. The bird's blood and yolk seeped between Liza's fingers. It stopped chirping. Then it stopped moving. In my exuberance and excitement of mundane facts, I had been swinging my hands around carelessly. My passion was my carelessness. I was and am the bringer of death. It's so cruel for such innocence to suffer. The next day, Bill and I went to a horse race. Liza was not in the mood for such sport, so she stayed home. "I wonder if there's a way to use electromagnets to change out horseshoes without using any nails," Bill pondered. "That's intriguing," I responded. "Yet I'm sure you'll find better inventions than that." Bill seemed upset that I didn't get excited about his idea. We lost a bit of money that day. It's always a quandary which horses we should back. Not long after we arrived home, my Aunt Mary marched in exhausted. "Where's Liza?" Cynthia called out. "I want to see her chicks." "They may still be a day out from hatching, Cynthia, but I'm sure Liza would love to show them to you," I said. I took her over to Liza's house. Her parents were home that day and sent us up to her room. Liza was always excited to see Cynthia, too. I might as well have not been in the room. "Do you want to see them growing?" Liza asked, motioning towards her basket. She unscrewed the lampshade from her lamp. She set an egg in the metal circle that sat just above the light. The whole egg turned red. Each egg had a bit of personality as she traded through them like a slideshow. Cynthia giggled with excitement and started giving them names. As Liza finished, she announced, I wrote a poem for the one we lost. I laughed a touch, then realized she was serious. I suddenly felt awful. Thankfully, she didn't notice because she was shuffling through papers. She looked down at the desired page and began. A shriek into the night, a solemn cry then silent. I held you in my sight, could give you no condolence. Innocent victim that gave no fight, our future once did seem so bright. A malady by careless blight. You weren't the only one in fright. Death could ne'er be in the right. I feel guilty receiving a condolence. I gazed at her softly. Again, I'm so sorry, I started. She cut me off. Victor, it was just an accident. And I know it's silly to make such a fuss about a chicken. It was just cathartic, to write a poem. I took her in my arms and kissed her. You, Cynthia cried out. Her blonde hair gleamed as she looked down. Come on, Cynthia. Let's go find your mother, I said. The chicks all hatched the next day, and we made a big event. Our housekeeper, Yvonne, made cupcakes with little Easter chick marshmallows on the top. My mother asked to keep one, and Liza graciously let her pick. My father rolled his eyes. This was the last big get-together where everyone was happy. The next semester started out slow. There's no more spots on the team, but I'd be eager for a collaboration, Professor Sleeman said. I took him up on the offer. I could easily finance the materials needed. Sleeman gave me the crash course on the concept. See, it really isn't too hard to understand. The flesh has to be dead. Living cells will instantly get cancerous, or at least under his method that was the case. 2,000 dead rats proved it. The dead rats, though, could have some of the rot reversed. It only worked on some parts of some of the rats some of the time. The solution isn't a difficult compound, being mostly salt and a hyper O2 rich water, with a touch of mercury to facilitate the hydrolysis. They haven't yet figured out the right amount of electricity to get consistent results. The galvanation jumped each cell to life, breathed the oxygen from the hydrolysis while it was releasing the hydrogen slowly into the air. Each cell resuscitated. The magnets weren't quite understood yet. It was thought at the time to aid in the nutrient flow, to keep the toxicities from building up by circulating the microscopic pieces of iron. This was kind of true. The addition of magnets certainly improved the rate of success. They were accelerating the rot for testing, which is why there was so much blood left in the pigskin. I was angry after hearing that. Obviously, that was an unnecessary variable. Clumsy science isn't science at all. I found a butcher shop, happy to part with some fresh pig cuts. Was that so hard, Henry? I had to seal off an apartment room, which did rein in the morbid scent quite well. The rot room, Bill called it. He stopped coming over after that. He wasn't eager to help, so I spent a lot of days alone. Buried in my work, as my mother called it. The day I started to have more success than Henry lit a fire in my heart unparalleled by any researcher. No offense. I started getting more than flesh to resuscitate, but even organ tissue too. There was still the problem of magnets though. I couldn't figure it out. I decided to get some sun and read on the campus. I suppose I needed to be around people too. The mutilated flesh was rotten company. I picked up a variety of magnet reading from the library. I needed more info than Google searches were allowing. I found a bit of shade and lost myself in the books. If only I could better understand what the magnets were actually doing. I had a feeling it was the key to getting better results. Bill sat down beside me. Those books are all 20 years out of date, Bill stated. I jumped and dropped the book. Bill couldn't stop laughing. His glasses shined in the sun. I'm embarrassed to admit how long he was sitting beside me and I didn't notice. If I had known you were this thick about magnets, I would have volunteered my help sooner, Bill smiled. I don't know why I hadn't thought to ask him. Where should I start? I asked. Come with me. I'll show you my lab. Wish you would have asked me a long time ago. I've been trying to show you for a year now. I felt dumb in a lot of ways. I hated that feeling so much. Bill's lab was simple. There was a machine that 3D printed magnets connected to a computer. I was shocked that the printer took up the whole length of the wall. We can make anything you'd like, said Bill proudly. The problem is, I don't know what I need, I said. So how do the magnets help the process? Bill asked. I wish I knew. No one knows. I suspect Professor Sleeman has an idea, since he was the one who thought to add them in. He isn't talking to me anymore, though. Bill looked at me amazed. I thought he was the whole reason you were doing this. I thought you wanted to impress him. I wanted to do this because I've never been more intrigued in my life, and to prove that understanding by applying it. Schliemann, I suspect, is jealous of my progress. We've grown weary of each other at any rate, I said. I didn't care to talk about it. His loss, I suppose, Bill consoled me. I'm guessing it has to do with keeping the iron in the cells from being disturbed too much by the electricity, I said. Also, there's a certain toxicity given off by dead tissue, and it may help the micro blood flow in the tissue by artificially circulating the nutrient. If that's the case, Bill stated, no wonder your results are all over the place. Here, let me print you a variety of micro patterns for your petri dish. Bill started sketching on his tablet. I don't suppose you can do tray-sized ones as well. I'm working on organs lately. Bill's jaw dropped open. It works on organs too? He was flabbergasted. I hadn't told anyone that. I decided to keep my discoveries to myself after that. Bill was harmless enough. But if Schliemann should hear, I'll print you some more for your petri dish experiment. If you find a pattern that works, then we'll make bigger ones. I'm excited for you, buddy. Sounds like you're reversing death. Makes my work feel trivial. Don't be too excited, I cautioned. I'm a ways from anything truly helpful. I suppose you'll be a footnote in the history books now, next to Schliemann too, I joked. Bill knew I was joking, but he looked pleased at the prospect. I suspect he'd deny any help now. I texted Liza to let her know I'd be doing research tonight. I opened the rot room and shut it tight behind me. With the window sealed off, there was only my dim apartment lighting, the light from my microscope, and the laptop screen. But it was enough. The smell hits like a rock to the gut. I made note and experimented all night. Bill's magnets were wonderful. I found 2 patterns that helped me the most. I started understanding what made it a good candidate for regeneration. Larger sections of skin and organ could easily be regenerated under the right conditions. The larger the animal, the more pieces I could regenerate. I could never save the whole animal, no matter the size. However, the cancerous reaction of the live flesh seemed to be from Schliemann's lack of precision. It wasn't necessarily a side effect. It became more and more clear to me that this wasn't the discovery of resurrect. But what was it all for? I was suddenly, once again, disgusted by the rotting flesh before me. It was all for naught. Saving whole organs, it seemed to be out of the question. Rarely could I ever get a tissue resurrection large enough to consider the organ alive. I sat alone in the rot, overwhelmed by my failures. I flipped the tables. All the petri dishes shattered. The batteries fell in disarray. I surveyed my disaster ambivalently. Despite all my progress, I was a failure. I called Liza. She asked how I was, and I lied. I listened to her talk the rest of the night. It was warming to me. Bill stopped by for the first time in forever. He sensed I was in dread, and we went to see a movie. I felt better that night, but still deep. What of my work? What of my discovery? I laid in bed and entertained my avarice. Surely there was something I was missing. I passed Professor Schliemann on the campus, heading to class. He gave me a nod as if he was ready to drop the pettiness. In light of my recent failures, I was not. I kept walking. 2 weeks passed. I was bored. School was only a light distraction. Bill went on about things. How's the rot reversal? He suddenly asked me. Small changes, but good, I lied. As he spoke, I just sat there and felt sorry for myself. I was, and still am, such a fool. Later that day, Liza called me. She was babysitting Cynthia for my aunt. Cynthia seemed upset, though. Her doll has ripped, Liza informed me. I'm working to repair it. I don't think she'll be happy again until it's together. How are the horses? I asked. We had one get bit by a snake, actually, she said in sudden alarm. Not mine, I hope. Well, not yours either, I hope, is what I mean, I stammered. It was one of the boarders. My father has been with the vet all afternoon. All of my family's and your family's horses are safe, at least, Liza sighed. As the conversation went on, I watched her stitch Cynthia's doll. A patch of a completely different color must have been all they had. Her fingers nimbly clenched the fabrics together. Then, with a big pull, the patch became one with the doll. Cynthia ripped it from Liza's hands as soon as the thread was cut, jarring the needle into Liza's finger. A drop of blood pooled on Liza's finger before she licked it. Her injury was my eureka moment. I felt as if I had a fever. I could smell the rotten flesh once more. I knew what to do. Liza, I've got to go. I may have a breakthrough. Geez, looking back, such a jerk. I ran to the store and practically broke my credit card, shoving it in the machine, waiting for the clerk to bag my stitching materials. You'd think I was restocking a running ambulance. Soon, I became an expert seamstress of skin. Pig after pig, I was able to sew together organ and limb. Slowly, I became more successful. I heard Bill knocking at the door. I didn't answer. How could I? I was Prometheus bringing fire to humanity. I kept noticing, though, bigger animals had better success rates. The bigger the limbs, the more tissue that could be healed. It took 100 rats to get enough tissue. The hog skin was too tough. I needed a large animal with soft skin. Normally at this point, I would return to society. I was uneasy at the thought. How could I leave the table? I collapsed in my lab for a few hours. I hadn't eaten or slept in days. I decided to run to the store and finally eat. After checking out, I overheard some med students talking about their cadaver. I ran over to them, and they recoiled from the speed of my approach. They explained I could get access to the cadaver parts if my research was approved by the cadaver board. My heart sank. If they saw my research, they'd steal it, I thought. I started rewriting my research, changing key details just enough that no one could replicate my success. I waited impatiently, practicing my muscle stitching on cats. Don't look at me like that, they were dead cats. Finally, I received an email. I could have access to 6 inches of cadaver skin for 2 days. I needed to return the skin once finished. This would have to do, though it wasn't enough. The access to the cadaver parts arrived. I rose from the bed like a child on Christmas morning and slept just as poorly too. Liza called me, but I didn't answer. All of my practice was paying off. I stitched together 2 good pieces of the tiny patch of skin. I'm not sure if I was breathing. I set the finely tuned magnets under the petri dish. I mixed my perfected solution and slowly drizzled it on the flesh. I hooked up the electrodes and attached the 9-volt batteries. I had done every step to the best of my ability. It sizzled. I watched. It boiled. I watched. It teemed. I watched. It bubbled. I watched. It began to pink. I watched. It began to live. I began to live. I took a sample to the microscope. The skin cells were accepting nutrients, and the mitochondria was active. It was, in the truest sense, alive. I had resurrected human tissue. Both sides of the stitching were coming together. The concept was proven. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think. I was dizzy by all the excitement. I suddenly understood what I could truly do. I thought of the organs that could save lives. I thought of the people who would never see decay. My discoveries would shock the world. My letter to the cadaver board was unwritable. How could I purvey such a discovery? No word would lend itself to my cause. Schliemann was sure to steal my research. After this was published, I froze. The keys of my keyboard became stone. My mind became wax. I stumbled from my desk, drunk with discouragement. If you've never held something so valuable before, you can never know the pain of dangling it. It was the world's most important discovery, locked away in the distance. And I alone held the keys. I wrote the worst letter I could. It wasn't on purpose, mind you. I couldn't think of what to say. I felt dismayed. I started to just write the truth. But would they even believe it? I needed to publish my findings before anyone would take this a step further. And I couldn't entertain the idea of Schliemann's crew stealing all of my good work and denying me a spot on the team again. Perhaps I would get some of the credit in his Nobel Prize speech. I threw up what little contents my stomach held. It was all too much. Barely speaking, barely eating, barely sleeping, I waited for 2 weeks. The email came back. I couldn't breathe. As I read, my hands shook. My heart sank. It said no. To be fair, it didn't say no as in never. It just denied me access at the present time. The weight, though, was unbearable. I was running out of options. If people only knew what I was doing, I'd had access to any cadaver I wished. Or perhaps Schliemann would have access to any cadaver he wished. I went to the morgue. They were very much unwilling to help. There's regulations, you know. I've no doubt you have good intention. But you've got to go through the proper channels on this one, the mortician informed me. I knew he was right, but I knew he was wrong. I sat outside the funeral home, heartbroken. I started to cry. An older lady approached me and put her hand on my shoulder. The pain doesn't ever go away, she said, but you learn to live with it. I stared at her dumbly, then stared back at my feet. He's taking it hard, huh? She said to her friend as she walked away. I looked up and saw a cheap coffin being lowered into a new grave. I had nothing to do, so I moseyed toward the diggers. I turned up my collar to the cold. My tears froze to my face. 2 men leaned against their shovels as the backhoe moved into position. They gazed at me lazily. "Did you know him or something?" The one on the left called out to me. He had one good eye that seemed to rest on my shoulder. "I just needed some air. I came out to see what you were doing," I said. "Yeah, I didn't expect you were kin to him," the gravedigger responded. "He was a hardened criminal who died in the slammer. We just drop 'em all in these back plots and move on. Don't even lay concrete on 'em." They silently started packing the dirt, desperate to say something to clear the air. "It's a sad fate to have no one mourn for you," I said, not knowing how those words would haunt me later. "Yeah," he said. We stood there silent for a few minutes. I walked away. I called a new cab and rode back in silence. I paid him and slammed the door. He sped away. Then it felt like someone just hit me with a shovel. I found the answer to all of my problems, and it was just 15 minutes away. I called a new cab. I bought a black car, tags and title, out the door for $1,200. It was such a small price to pay for this. I got a shovel from the hardware store and some nice gloves. At this point, I was convinced that the end justifies the means. Who would care or notice the exclamation? Surely I'd be pardoned for this small crime after everyone knows I could throw their replacement parts in a faceless and faithless, nameless criminals. After all, I thought, it's about time they gave back to society. I won't be the first scientist to use criminals as unwitting cadavers. Like the mud on my clothes that evening, it would all come out in the wash. It took 5 trips and 8 bodies to retrieve the necessary parts. I could only select the recent grade. Brutes, these men were absolute Goliaths in form. The larger form made it easier to patch the body together, but it certainly left me with a sore back. This was a surprisingly easy crime to get away with. My new cadavers were all inside. Time is all that stood between me and certain success. I knew every moment of research had prepared me for this. The body I was to construct, you see, would have been a refrigerator of sorts. Humanity's own garden in which to reverse the ill effects of death, with the organ donors being none the wiser. Liza was calling me again. I didn't answer. Bill kept calling too. How could I respond? I looked down the hall, and my research study seemed to be calling to me. I locked every door, turned on the one dim light, and began. I began stitching, selecting, and dividing. I'm not sure I was blinking. It took almost a full day, but with no windows, nor the desire to see a watch. How could I be sure? I heard the rain outside of the roof of the apartment building. I kept stitching. I kept stitching. I kept stitching. I imagined the faces of the other researchers once my work was finished. I imagined Schliemann's smug affirmation that I had succeeded in what he could not. I hooked up the batteries and laid the cadaver in the vat of my improved solution. I set a drip in his veins so that he could make blood. The tissue simmered in the vat. I could see the effects of the reversal on the edges of the skin. It was only a matter of time. I felt at ease for the first time since I saw the pigskin revive. It was working. I was about to have a living organ donor. I was writing the abstract for the paper in my head. The one light was dim, but my eyes were wide as an owl's. The calm I felt at first was welting into excitement once more. I knew it was mere moments till my success was imminent. I became jittery all over. The batteries were waning. The solution turned a greenish color. The magnets below swirled an orange iron byproduct. Around the whirlpool. Then it happened. A single heartbeat sounded off as a drum. A faint breath eeped out. The heartbeat sounded off again and seemed to echo off the walls. Another faint breath crept out from the nostrils. The heartbeat quickened, slowly. I felt the instruments on the table shake. Smoke and steam started to hover off the vat and fall to the floor. Then he drew a full breath. It was a powerful breath. The muscles all at once contracted. His neck raised suddenly. I jumped back. I hit my head on the room's light for a final burst of day. With the flash, I saw his grotesque jaw twist into a smile of sorts just before my microscope light became the only beam to illuminate the horror. He tilted towards me in a violent manner. I lost all nerve and backed into a wall. He sat up. A dark frame moved nearer to me. I shrieked and fled to my room. Cowering by my bed, I heard a gruff breath. I smelled the rot issuing forth from his lungs and trembled violently. I looked up only to scream. The blood was oozing from the stitches in his neck. The moonlight was shining through the window just so his eyes could glow back at me. The loose stitch loop in his cornea seemed to almost touch me. I jolted back and hit my head on the windowsill I was ducking under. I must have passed out, because when I opened my eyes again, he was gone.